But when Reagan's entertaining this abolitionist fantasy, getting rid of nuclear weapons, he says to him, and the notes show this, Mikhail, 10 years from now, I'll be a very old man. We can come back here, bury the last nuclear weapon, and have a party for the whole world. And I realized he was seeing it as a movie.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with the novelist Thomas Mallon, who also teaches at George Washington University. His latest book is Finale, a novel of the Reagan years. Tom, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
This is a phenomenal book. I will, put it all out there. I was just completely mesmerized. Describe the setting and the scene of this book for us.
Most of it takes place in late 1986, which is probably Ronald Reagan's low point as president. Everything seems to be going wrong. There's this host of new social ills that the administration doesn't seem well equipped to deal with, from AIDS to crack to homelessness. The Democrats are about to take the Senate. The Reykjavik Summit, which in the fullness of time looks pretty good, at the time was really perceived as a fiasco.
It was a total disaster.
And of course Iran-Contra is beginning. So,
and as you point out here, and which is documented really, that Reagan's mind was starting to slip a few gears.
Right. I mean, I'm not a clinician. I don't know to what extent. And what was happening too was that was compounding this remoteness in him, which was sort of constitutional, always part of him. Even Nancy, for all the vaunted closeness of that marriage, in her memoir, she says there were places within him that she never was able to go to.
And that was part of his political power, really, right? That nobody could really understand what he was actually thinking. It made him
surprisingly malleable. I mean, Reagan could be quite flexible politically, even though he was what Mrs. Thatcher would call a conviction politician, not a consensus one. And I also think that it gave a strange kind of energy to his administration. I mean, in any organization, everybody wants to figure out the boss, wants to please the boss. He was so confusing to so many people that I think they spent an enormous amount of time and energy doing that. And it might have given a strange kind of boldness and creativity to the administration.
God is kind of, he's present, but he's distant, so you're desperate to please him and you're trying all sorts of stuff.
And Reagan at moments, I think, could be amazingly profound. At other moments, I think he could be unbelievably silly.
Right.
And I knew about 2 weeks into working on this book that I was never going to be able to make him a point of view character. Only for one scene does that happen.
And we'll talk a little bit about that. Talk about some of the other characters. Pamela Harriman.
Pamela Harriman is sort of the dowager queen of the Democrats' government in exile. She's the widow of Averell Harriman at this point. She's gotten all of his money.
She had been married to Winston Churchill's son.
To Randolph Churchill. Then she'd been married to Leland Hayward, the theatrical producer. She had had scads of affairs with rich, important men, Johnny Agnelli, Ellie de Rothschild. And her latest incarnation is this political one, and she is a hostess in Georgetown and also the head of a very powerful political action committee, which has a great deal to do with the Democrats' success in recapturing the Senate that year. So she's there. Nancy Reagan is there. I think the portrait of Nancy is sympathetic overall, but she's...
it's complicated and she's bitchy.
Oh yeah, she's a tremendous artist, but she's kind of a raw nerve. And I don't think Mrs. Reagan enjoyed 1 hour of the time she was in the White House. I mean, she wanted to be there desperately, but she was constantly worried about her husband's reputation, short-term, long-term.
Then, of course, Christopher Hitchens, a journalist who was very friendly to Reason during his all-too-brief life.
They were the last significant political group in the country to notice what was obvious to the rest of us from the start, which is that Ronald Reagan is a fraud. And now they realize that he didn't mean a word he really said, that he let down even his dearest friends.
Why is Hitchens in there, and what role does he play in this?
I loved Christopher. He was a good friend of mine. I didn't know him till later in his life. I first met him well into the 90s. But this is Hitchens in his mid to late 30s. He's still fairly new to the States. He's still trying to figure out what his career dimensions are going to be. I have him migrating to Vanity Fair and the Slick magazines a little bit earlier than he did, while he's still writing for
the nation,
ill-paying places, yes. Like that.
And it's interesting because even with Hitchens, it's a very sympathetic, but there's a number of warts in that portrait, or tensions where, both sexual as well as financial. Yeah. He wants big money, but he also still is talking about how the Sandinistas are, somehow morally superior.
When I was writing lines for him, if I thought really hard and got lucky, in maybe 15 minutes, I could come up with a line that was half as funny as something he would have said at the dinner table in, with 15 seconds.
And then possibly the greatest revelation here, at least to this reader of American fiction, is your portrayal of Merv Griffin. Talk a little bit, and this is the type of book where all sorts of interesting, bizarre, off-the-wall characters come in and out. What is Merv Griffin's function in this?
He's mostly on the telephone in the book. He's only in a couple of scenes face-to-face, but he was a pal of Nancy Reagan's. He was tremendously rich by this point. He just sold his company for $250 million.
And he created Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune, among other things, and was about to lose his shirt on a deal with Donald Trump, actually, to buy Resorts International.
Who does not appear in the book. There was one reference to Leona Helmsley. She was the only 80s plutocrat, and it got cut. But Merv is one of Nancy Reagan's phone pals. Nancy Reagan probably spent as much time on the phone while she was in the White House as Lyndon Johnson did. She was never without it. And Merv frequently calls her up to say, ooh, great speech, and to buck her up a little bit and to share Hollywood gossip with her.
The protagonist of the novel, if there is one, the invented character, is someone named Anders Little, who is at the National Security Council. So he is somebody who is kind of weaving around through Iran-Contra. He's at Reykjavik. Talk a little bit about this character, and he's also on a journey of self-discovery about his sexuality.
He is, coming out, at least to himself, well into his 30s after 2 brief marriages, and his true believerness in Reagan's foreign policy is being tested by events.
But he had started out, he was a loyal Democrat.
Yeah.
And then he became convinced of essentially what became known as a neocon.
That's right. His mentor is Gene Kirkpatrick. When he's very young, he's up at the UN working under her. This shows him about 5 years beyond that. And Anders is conflicted, even tormented. He's a compulsive runner, and he is clearly very vulnerable.
Why is Anders conflicted over his sexuality, and what does it mean in the context of, he's a hawk who actually ultimately is vindicated in his beliefs that a strong policy towards the Soviet Union is right?
I've always been betwixt and between politically. I'm a gay man myself. I was sympathetic to Reagan's foreign policy, not sympathetic to a lot of the rest of the things that were going on. I was, dealing with my sick friends in New York, and we were waiting for a kind word from Reagan about AIDS. And so I hadn't intended on dealing really with any of that in the book, but it was so much my 80s that it found its way into the book. I've always been fascinated, though, partly because I've all my life been challenged by my liberal friends, which is most of them. How the hell can you, a gay man, throw your lot in so often, with these Republican characters? Whereas on social issues, I'm probably not libertarian in the sense you guys have of the term, but the way an ordinary political commentator might have of that term. And, so I've always...
Does that mean that you're in favor of gay marriage, but not the gold standard?
I think it means I don't make gay marriage the gold standard of, or the litmus test for who I vote for. I'm in favor of gay marriage, but I wish it had not been the Supreme Court that decided it. But I am interested in, there was a tremendous gay subtext to Iran-Contra. This fellow Spitz Channel, who died quite young, and a lot of the people who were involved. An earlier novel, mine called Fellow Travelers, dealt to some extent with the gay subtext of the McCarthy period. And
it's fascinating then because McCarthy himself, and I think you've written about this or talked about it in interviews, where he was a libidinous boozer who got grabby, whenever he got drunk. He was surrounded by gay men.
Right.
It's not clear what's going on with all of that, but then somebody like J. Edgar Hoover very consciously linked being gay with being a communist or being subversive, and there's all of these interesting moments of doubling, you know, if you live a double life, can you really be American, et cetera. So,
one of the epigraphs in this novel, Fellow Travelers of mine, has Daniel Patrick Moynihan's quote, in the age of security clearances, to be Irish Catholic was prima facie evidence of anti-communism. Harvard men were to be checked, Fordham men would do the checking. You know, growing up Irish Catholic around New York at the apex of Catholic influence in America, the New York Archdiocese, the Kennedy presidency, whatever. I mean, we considered ourselves, I think, super Americans in a way, because we were militantly anti-communist. We were not squishily so like liberal Protestants. And, but how that could combine with or even survive proximity to something like one's own homosexuality clearly was something that interested me.
And are we past that point? Have we kind of gotten out of that historical, you know, tar patch?
I don't think so. I like to think that the Supreme Court decision sort of settled the matter so that we could get on to more interesting things. I mean, I think that one of the things was, even in the 1980s, I never felt as oppressed as an ordinary heterosexual living in Poland. And I was very cognizant of that. I had my troubles, and there were certain things I wished were otherwise, but Anders even says this in the book, I'm willing to stand in line for my freedom. And, but I think in the course of the fight for gay marriage in particular that led up to the Supreme Court decision, people have gotten so dug in that I find the reaction to any expression of conservatism, say on my part, to be even more censorious maybe than it ever was.
Talk a little bit about your conservatism then, because this is something in the libertarian movement, you know, small L, there's always been a lot of gay people, gay and lesbian people, who, you know, felt, okay, well, look, I'm anti-communist, I'm anti-government, because the government, you know, it's government cops and government agents who are like rousting me. And yet I couldn't, you know, like I can't feel comfortable being with liberals because they, you know, they want to empower the state even more. Is it that complicated for, or why did the public gay identity seem to go so far to the left? In the short run, the left was pushing particular portions of the gay rights agenda, and so it was understandable. In the long term, I'm not sure that reliance on the state, you know, is so good for anybody's freedom. And it is true in the 80s. I mean, the way that Republicans, and many Democrats actually, but it became more of a kind of defining issue of the Republicans, people like Jesse Helms, I mean, were virulently homophobic and anti-gay, and you know, I don't recall hearing anybody in the Democratic Party talking about AIDS as divine retribution for you know, a bad lifestyle.
If the homosexuals and IV drug abusers would stop their abnormal practices this day, there would never be another new case of AIDS in the United States. And I mean, you have the very conflicted Terry Dolan here, who's the head of the very conservative PAC, who is himself gay and dies of AIDS late in '86. And so there was that, you know, stratum in the Republican Party. But I think that you know, it was natural enough for gay activists to gravitate toward the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And yet, you know, I remember conversations in the 80s that I would have where I would have to listen to gay friends be rhapsodic about Fidel Castro and, you know, the level of medical care in Cuba. And I give, Anders has one of these lines too, where he says it's a variant of what I used to tell people, well, you know, dress up like Carmen Miranda on Friday night and you're going to be cutting sugarcane on Monday. And, or you can share a prison cell with your lover. And you know, and to me, the only way to operate was to try to operate according to the largest possible political issues and try to operate in a way that would maximize freedom for everyone. And then, you know, as they used to say, boring from within, to push on the people that you were
allying yourselves with.
Do you feel like, I mean, do you consider yourself a Republican then in terms of partisan terms?
It's funny, I was actually in the George W. Bush administration. For a while I was at the NEH, which is not an organization libertarians are going to like. I was the deputy chair for a couple of years. And I remember, I was first on the National Council. And I remember the call from the White House Personnel Office, which sounds funny to begin with. I said, well, there are two things you've got to know about me. I said, I can only serve as an openly gay man. And that was fine, that's no problem. This was the compassionate conservative era. And then the second one is I said, you know, I'm not a registered Republican. I said, I voted for the president, but I'm not registered. I eventually did register as a Republican, which is probably a flaw in my moral character, but I thought, you know, I take the king's shilling, I am the king's man. But after the 1980s, I could never imagine again voting for a Democrat for president, because I do think that the Democratic Party, by and large, not everyone in it, but by and large the Democratic Party walked away from the Cold War, which was the biggest issue of my lifetime.
You paint a picture of, you know, it seems like the Cold War is about to be lost. The Americans are about to lose it. Obviously, Reykjavik turns out to be a breakthrough. And Reagan is revealed as a genius kind of negotiator. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, your work is suffused with a kind of appreciation for the ironies of history. Talk a bit about how that plays out in the grand scheme of this book.
I think Reagan knocked Gorbachev off balance a lot at Reykjavik for the same reasons he knocked his staff off balance a lot. Gorbachev couldn't figure him out. And when Reagan is really proposing to Gorbachev that they think about getting rid of nuclear weapons entirely, something he walks away from because he won't give up SDI.
Right. The Star Wars, Strategic Defense Initiative, which at the time was widely criticized, even by people, or it was widely disbelieved even by people within Reagan's administration, that this was some kind of weird fantasy that the old man had.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
Here, an artist's projection of the president's vision.
Particle beam weapons with pulsing rays join the attack.
But the Soviets believed in it enough to think that if they keep researching this, we've got to research it too. And that was, I think, what ultimately was the boon of Reykjavik, that they went home and sort of spent themselves into this death spiral. But when Reagan's entertaining this abolitionist fantasy, getting rid of nuclear weapons, he says to him, and the notes show this, Mikhail, I mean, the note taker makes a point of showing he used his first name, 10 years from now, I'll be a very old man. We can come back here, bury the last nuclear weapon, and have a party for the whole world. And he goes on with this and he says, you'll say, Ron, is that you? And I'll say, Mikhail, it's good to see you. And I realized he was seeing it as a movie. So his theatrical experience, I think, in many ways served him quite well. But I do not believe the Cold War would have ended, certainly not when it did, had Reagan not pushed on the Soviet Union for the whole 8 years.
So, and very much in the book is the idea that whether or not the communism was beset by internal strife or internal contradictions, he helped make it spend itself into obsolescence.
I can't stand what I call the Strobe Talbott view of the Cold War, which is while Reagan was provoking the Soviet Union in the early 80s, oh, we have to learn to coexist. The Soviet Union is too big to antagonize like this. And then the minute the Soviet Union collapsed, see, they were too weak to have worried about it all along. I don't think you can have it both ways like that. When Reagan was asked his view of the Cold War by the man who became his national security advisor, while he was still just the governor of California, or ex-governor thinking about running for president. And Richard Allen asked him, well, what's your view of the Cold War, Governor? And Reagan looks at him and he goes, we win, they lose. And to me, that was moral clarity. And I saw in the 80s the Democratic Party walking away from the policies of Truman and Kennedy and Johnson, which had been aggressive toward communism.
Kennedy beat Nixon by painting Nixon as soft on
the missile gap. And even if their policy was only containment, But you know, by the mid-70s, the Soviet Union was on the march everywhere in Africa, Central America, whatever.
Where do you end up on the question of Nixon? Because he obviously, on a certain level, you know, he was the great instigator of détente, and it seemed that he was more than happy to live in a world with the Soviet Union. In many ways, he wanted it to always exist.
Nixon was like Margaret Thatcher, was incredibly opposed to this notion of abolition. I mean, he thought if we draw down nuclear weapons to zero, the Soviets are going to roll over Europe with conventional forces. But I think in a way, Reagan, because he was simpler than Nixon in some ways, more sentimental than Nixon, whatever, he allowed himself to imagine a world without the Soviet Union, which Nixon's mind, much more brilliant than Reagan's, couldn't quite bring himself to do.
One of the things for, you know, I was too young to really catch this on the first run, but when you go back and you look, I'm not even sure if Nixon was on the Merv Griffin show or the Mike Douglas show or Dinah Shore, but he is an incredible conversationalist.
Even comedians who refer to Richard Nixon as a loser.
Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Lincoln, all lost elections before they won the big one.
Nixon was the politician who dominated my lifetime, in many ways much more than Reagan, even though Reagan is sort of the climax of the Cold War. I mean, my first real political memory is the 1960 election. I went to fourth grade every day wearing a Nixon button. Some Catholics.
Where was this?
This was on Long Island. Okay. And we were, you know, all Irish Catholics, but my father and all of the other men on the street, the vast majority of them were for Nixon, not Kennedy. They looked at Kennedy and they saw somebody who'd gone to Harvard. They looked at Nixon and he looked like what they were doing.
That is certainly the Irish Catholic that I come out of. Yeah. I mean, there's that small minority of people who are Kennedy haters, precisely because he was the better version of themselves, right?
And Nixon was, you know, he was the president for my entire college career, and the complexities of him, the moral failures of him. I don't know what it says about my character, but I never had any difficulty, I never felt any difficulty writing from inside out with Nixon. Nixon was, and is in this book too, a point of view character.
Does any of this matter anymore? What does it mean now that we have Putin, who is a diminutive version of the Soviet Union or of Gorbachev or Brezhnev? In the Middle East, we have a feckless American president whose foreign policy is terrible and probably almost as bad as the one before that, who was a Republican.
Right.
What is the pressing relevance of this for today's America?
In a way, the world that was bequeathed to recent presidents by Reagan and Bush, they were given a splendid gift. None of them has cherished it properly.
Is this the one more kind of nail in the baby boomers' coffin, that they they were given everything and they just fucked it up?
You know, I think the first George Bush was a very good manager of the end of the Cold War, but I think Clinton, for all his personal recklessness, was a very cautious president in foreign policy. He did not really consolidate the Pax Americana that he inherited. And currently, I mean, I think things are terrible. I mean, Putin, I think, is essentially a fascist. And Obama does not have a clue as to how to deal with him. The Russians are running rampant in the Middle East right now. They've allied themselves to...
Should we care? I mean, and this is the libertarian speaking. You know what? It wasn't our fight to begin with. And why would... You know, whose children should go over there to die, you know, for people who will, you know, in a couple of generations be sending terrorists over here?
Well, they're going to be sending more of them, and sooner, I think, if we don't do that. I mean, you know, if they're not fought over there, they're going to be fought over here. And I can't stand the president's relish, the current president's relish, for a small American footprint. This is very unlibertarian to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, is that because you cannot conceive of a world in which America is not the top dog? I mean, where you know, in every other aspect of our lives, we understand that, you know what, Americans don't have to be number one in steel manufacturing for us to be very good. We don't have to win every Olympic event We don't have to play chess anymore, thank God that the Cold War is over. We don't have to pretend to like chess. Why do we have to be everywhere in the world?
Well, that goes back to that Catholic childhood where, you were inculcated with the sense that you were the super Americans, and the belief in America was second only to belief in God, and they went together. If you watched Bishop Sheen every week on television, the way I did. And I do believe that. And I mean, the famous Barbara Jordan quote about the Constitution, I would sort of say the same thing, sentimental as it sounds, about America. My faith is whole, it is total, it is complete. No one else is going to do it. And I do know that in the largest, certainly in the largest political theoretical sense, that is at odds with a libertarian view.
But is it also, does it lead the U.S. into situations where we're so morally compromised that we cannot really lead the world? Because ultimately what you're talking about really is a moral vision as much as a kind of geopolitical one. And it's like if the United States is torturing people, if the United States is dropping bombs indiscriminately on hospitals in the name of liberating the people. I mean, this goes back to, we're in a weird phase where we're almost destroying countries in order to preserve them, which harkens back to a Vietnam conundrum. I mean, is that vision in a post-Cold War world? Because there is no existential threat to the United States. Radical Islam is a pimple. It's herpes. It's not AIDS. I mean, it almost seems like you're creating a monster that we have to slay, and then
boy, you're awfully soft on religion for a libertarian. I'd put radical Islam much higher up the list.
I think it was V.S. Nepal shortly after 9/11. He said he doesn't fear the Islamists because they can fly planes into buildings, but they can't build the planes themselves, and that there's a lot of truth to that. That it's a defensive, it's a suicide cult. It's not. It's not part of the West like communism was.
Yeah. We were morally compromised winning the Cold War. I mean, look at Iran-Contra. I mean, the Contras contained some of the shadiest and most thuggish people.
And also the fact that Reagan reneged on one of his main promises, that we would never trade, we wouldn't trade weapons for hostages, and that he also believed in the Constitution while subverting it every opportunity.
It was a very ill-chosen, dirty skirmish, but I think one of the reasons Reagan comes out all right in history is that people look at the Contra part of Iran-Contra and say, well, dirty as it was and foolish as it was one battle in this much larger war, which ultimately did have a moral content to it, and which he ultimately was on the winning side of.
Let's talk a little bit more broadly about literature or contemporary novel writing. You're one of the only serious novelists who not only lives in D.C. but actually writes about politics and power. And what has happened? I mean, you were a protege, or you had a fond relationship with Mary McCarthy, a novelist and memoirist and political commentator from an earlier period who was very outspoken in her generally left-wing views.
I cannot understand how the public could identify itself with Nixon. I simply cannot understand it. I could understand their identifying with LBJ, with Truman, even with Eisenhower in some sort of son or daughter relation to Eisenhower. I cannot see how the people looking at that man on television could identify themselves with him.
There were writers like Norman Mailer and Gore Vidal and Saul Bellow, all over the political spectrum. These guys traded, and women traded in big ideas about the politics of the day. Today, that seems to be almost completely vacant. From serious fiction. Why do you think
these
that is?
big figures, most of them born in the teens and the 20s. Mary was
and again, I realize now also Catholic, so this is
yes,
very
well, there's
much
that too. But she had that Jewish grandmother, the Hitchens streak in her. Mary politically, her original identity, for all that she's so identified with the left, going to Vietnam and all of the rest, she was an anti-Stalinist. Not easy to be in 1930s, 1940s literary New York. She had a flirtation with Trotskyism, And her politics sort of were accidental, but the anti-communist aspect of them, which is so much part of her early life, that was in many ways what appealed to me about her. But in terms of just political zeal and mixing it up, yes, I find that they were infinitely more interesting than the novelists of my generation. Novelists of my generation won't even take one another on in book reviews. Mm-hmm. I mean, the writers you're mentioning, they were constantly feuding with one another, attacking one another, coming to one another's aid, whatever. In the book reviews that exist today, the editor will call up one literary novelist asking him to review another, and he'll say, well, send me the book, and if I like it, I'll do the review. Because nobody wants to antagonize somebody they're going to meet at a writer's conference, things like that. And there is such a generic default politics. I mean, 95%.
Elucidate that. Yeah,
95% of the writers I know are liberal Democrats, and
do they even care about politics, really, or is it kind of a?
I think they think
it's like a coat that they put on when it gets chilly, but they don't really care.
I think they think they do, but they're not much engaged by it. They sign the petitions that everybody else is signing, so that there's an infinite lack of surprise in seeing their names there. I don't think that they're that much engaged. There's a kind of lockstep about it, and I don't think it's very fresh.
Are they all thinking the same because they all come out of the same basic socioeconomic milieu, or is it that they're confessional and we're in an age of kind of personal introspection and memoir? I think of someone like Jonathan Franzen, whose major political commitments seem to be preserving habitat for wild animals in Central Park of New York, or he recently said that he was thinking about adopting an Iraqi child in order to learn something about the third world. I mean, these are, he's not a stupid person and he's a gifted writer, but these are idiotic statements. Where is that coming from?
I don't think it's so much that they all come out of the same world as that they all wind up in the same world. They all teach. They're all tenured novelists, they ride the same circuit. Their lives are very similar. In past generations, novelists were not tied to the academy the way they are now. They had much more disparate backgrounds. You used to pick up book flaps and say somebody has worked as a lobsterman and bridge builder. That doesn't happen much anymore. And among most of the writers I know, their politics, they're a token of good breeding. They're a token, they're a credential.
So it's like you losing the Long Island accent.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's that you take a kind of centrist, maybe a little edgy towards the left on a
but it shows you're fit for polite society. And I was at a dinner party on Saturday night with some writers, and I said at one point the mildest thing against the incumbent of the White House, and
you can't even say his name. He's that man in the White House, right?
That man in the White House, and all I said was that we were on Reagan, and I said, well, Reagan, he raised the age level for presidents, which is why we're going to have this Altercocker primary among the Democrats. But I said, I think what Obama did, of course, was lower the experience level, and that's why we have all these first-term senators running for president. You could see the look like, oh, please don't go there, Tom. We like you. You're a nice guy, but please don't go beyond the pale. And it was as if I, had picked up a bread roll and might have thrown it. And so what did I do as a member of the same polite society there? And I just desisted, and we moved on to other topics.
Who were the novelists that that excite you today?
Several years ago, the New York Times Book Review asked a bunch of us to name what we thought was the best novel of the last 25 years. And at that point, I said it was Underworld, and it was Don DeLillo, who I think is tremendous.
Isn't somebody like Don DeLillo a great example of his entire work led up to 9/11, including in, I think it might have been Running Dogs. He actually had figures look at the World Trade Centers and fantasize about destroying them.
We can never underestimate the willingness of the state to act out its own massive fantasies. What about the individual?
And then when a massive act, an unbelievable novelistic act of violence happens, he kind of takes a break for a couple of years and then comes back with a minor book, I think, Falling Man, which is not even real. I mean, it starts in New York and then it dissipates into a kind of global poker tournament.
Right, yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that he's he almost like one of his own characters. He is presented this world historic opportunity and blows it.
I remember reading Underworld and writing about it and thinking, how am I going to live outside this Manichaean world that I grew up in, which I think, you know, that novel embodies very brilliantly. And I think he may be, not even entirely consciously, he may be struggling with that, you know, as well. I love reading Martin Amis, and in many ways...
you must love his anti-communist books in particular. I mean, things
yeah,
like Cope with the
he
Dread.
Sort of, he grew a little into that. You know, he sort of grew into his father's politics to some extent.
Hopefully minus the anti-Semitism and the, well, maybe not the misogyny, but
I don't think that my generation of novelists is producing the books that were produced after the Second World War by writers who were born typically between the two world wars. I don't think...
Is that because the novel, I mean, in a way, the novel as a cultural form has kind of lost its gas? I mean, it's run out of gas.
Very much so,
and I mean that partly, again, to sound like a Marxist, if, you know, feudalism gave us the epic poem or the epic, and romance, you know, the Industrial Revolution gave us the novel, and now we're moving into, is it art, is it film? Is it another form that is capturing the complexity of society?
I think that there is such a premium on documenting things. Every person holding up his iPhone 100 times a day to take a picture of something, everybody posting his thoughts on the internet, whatever. I think the whole notion of fictionalizing anything begins to seem precious and trivial to a lot of people. They don't see fiction's expansive possibilities anymore. I think that's why, among many young writers, memoir has taken over from fiction. And you know, first books that would typically have been autobiographical novels are now published as memoirs. The memoirs contain every bit as much fiction as those autobiographical novels used to contain. But there is this frisson that people get from the notion of reality. I mean, in an extreme, you know, people who started out as fiction writers, David Shields, a little younger than I am, you know, they've just really walked away from it because it just doesn't seem to be, it doesn't seem to challenge them, it doesn't seem to fulfill them anymore.
Tom Wolfe, who kind of navigated a fairly spectacular turn from creative nonfiction or new journalism, whatever we want to call it, to fiction, and I think his most successful fiction work was his first novel, Bonfire, The Vanities. But he talked a lot about how in the early 60s, Philip Roth wrote an essay where he said, you know, the problem for novelists is that we can't keep up with the bizarreness and the absurdity of contemporary life. And Wolfe said, you know, this was great. Novelists walked away from that and they started writing about themselves, writing about writing, metafiction, surf fiction, whatever you wanted to call it. And so journalists moved in to document things in creative ways, and that explains, you know, the electric Kool-Aid acid test and Hell's Angels and In Cold Blood, nonfiction novels, The Executioner Song. And then Wolfe came back when he wrote The Bonfire of the Vanities in the 80s and said, you know what, we need the novel, not of manners, but of society, a thick cut of society such as you've provided here in Finale and your other works. Will that be enough, do you think, to kind of revive the novel or regain interest in it?
As Margaret Thatcher might have answered the question, no, a single word. I don't. I mean, the passage he made to go from nonfiction to fiction was quite a solitary journey, and I think he infuriated a lot of established novels, especially because the first book was this enormous bestseller that was also rapturously received. I don't see right now any signs that the trend is going to be reversed, although with very young writers, I find the students I teach writing to, whatever, they are, a surprising number of them are really interested in fantasy writing. The most fictional kind of fiction. And
I mean, it's fiction that is built upon building and imagining worlds.
And video games, and lots of dungeons, and lots of fair maidens, and lots of vampires. And this leaves me cold. And I mean, when they submit manuscripts like this, I have to tell them, like, I got nothing to bring to this. We're going to have to set you up with somebody else. But certainly the notion of the great American novel that's going to capture the spirit of the age, I think that's been gone for a long time.
Well, maybe the great American novel is busily being written in Shanghai?
Entirely possible, or pirated.
Yes, that's right, or being rewritten. Well, we'll leave it there. The novel is Finale, a novel of the Reagan years by Thomas Mallon. I can't recommend it enough. Tom, thanks for talking.
Thank you very much.
For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.